Thank you all for making time for today's release. I would kindly request that we put ourselves on mute if we are not speaking so that we minimize the background noise. And I would also want to do a quick roll call, as this is very critical for some apex organizations. I would want to be sure we have the relevant organizations present at this presentation. So if I can see by a hand raise if we have NBSSI on board, that is the National Board for Small Scale Industries. Just show by hand. Do we have AGI? Do you have Chamber of Commerce? Do you have the Private Enterprise Foundation? Okay, we don't seem to have any of them. Invitations were sent out to them. Hopefully, they're going to join us at a time that we're sharing with you highlights of the business tracker. I would also want to find out if UNDP is represented.
Yes,
okay,
Prof.
Frederick, thank you for showing up your hand. You're welcome. And also if World Bank is represented. Okay, thank you, Elwin. So I would begin by indicating that it's impressive to see that we have in excess of 70 people joining us for today's release. And also physically, we have in excess of 10 people with us at the head office. So in attendance now, we have more than 80 people witnessing the release of the business tracker. Good morning once again. As was indicated last week when we were doing the release of the effect of COVID-19 on households and jobs, we indicated that during COVID-19, GSS conceptualized 3 different surveys. One was in the area of households and job tracker. The other is what we're going to present to you today, which is on the business tracker. And the third one, which will be releasing its results later in the week, is the local economy tracker. What we intended to do broadly from each of these 3 trackers was primarily to identify the pathways and assess the extent of the effect of the pandemic on either households and jobs, businesses, and for that matter, the local economy. So today's presentation will be focusing on the extent and the pathways of the effect of the pandemic on businesses in Ghana. Why are we doing this? We are aware that, yes, undeniably, unquestionably, COVID-19 has impacted on businesses. But what policymakers would want to know is the different dimensions that their business operations have been affected, are being affected, and will be affected by the ramifications of COVID-19. In the latest release of the update from the president, that is update number 14, which was issued on 26 July 2020, the president reaffirmed government's determination to save lives, jobs, livelihoods, revitalize the economy, and safeguard the future of our country. And this has been done through a number of interventions intended to mitigate the challenges associated with COVID-19. In the context of the business tracker, what is very important for us are 2 things. One is the package, that is the 600 million Ghana cedi stimulus that have been targeted to businesses by way of cushioning them to overcome the challenges associated with COVID-19. Beyond this specific intervention are other interventions, i.e. macro level interventions such as the tax dimensions that are coming in that will also go a long way to support businesses. As government continues detailing out the specifics associated with these interventions, at GSS we deem it necessary to think through the specific pathways to help guide or provide guidance to the government in helping these businesses. So what we are going to do is to share with you data that we collected over the period May and June 2020, which we identified over 70 analyzable variables. And the intention is that we're going to follow these businesses at least 3 different times before the year ends. This will give us an opportunity to have a panel data of businesses, and what would the intrinsic value in there is that it will give us the opportunity to see businesses move in and out of the interventions as they are being rolled out. This would guide us in getting a sense of how sustainable these interventions are. Also, with the cohort data that we're going to collect over time, it would give us an opportunity to situate it, one, in the context of the Integrated Business Establishment Survey, which we conducted in 2015, and also moving forward, it gives us a panel data so that as we roll out our next Integrated Business Establishment Survey, we would have a cohort of businesses that will be following over time. There will be replacement in some instances, and the value in there is that it would help us, like households, get businesses that we can incubate and take them out of poverty. The service would continue to have a positive aggression towards the fight of COVID-19. And this is simply because the president in his statement articulated that we're going to fight COVID-19 with science and data. Therefore, as Statistical Service, this is our responsibility. And that is what we're going to seek doing moving forward. I want to say a very special thank you to the United Nations Development Program, the World Bank, the Apex business organization, specifically MBSSI, that we nurtured this idea with from the onset, for providing both financial and technical support to see to the realization of this first release. Conditioned on the use of data and the support that we are getting, we are sanguine that the economy is going to rebound. So on behalf of the board, management, and entire staff of GSS, please accept my deepest appreciation for making time for this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for the wonderful welcome address. We will now switch into having a remark from the UNDP. Frederick, please give us a remark.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, good morning. Let me begin by thanking colleagues in Ghana Statistical Service, the World Bank, and the UNDP. But above all, the more than 4,000 businesses that invested their time to provide information. And it is them that are making this success. I also want to recognize our colleagues from the media and emphasize the importance they have in this process of protecting and indeed helping transform the businesses. We are here because businesses are central to our lives and, frankly speaking, to the functioning of governments. We cannot hope to protect jobs or government revenues, whether at the local level or national level, without protecting businesses. As you all know, we are in the middle of the pandemic, which is testing whether these businesses can really endure its onslaught. During today's launch, we shall appreciate the negative impact it has had on businesses, while at the same time looking to opportunities to build back better. We have to recognize that within our context, the quick wins may well come from the policy choices related, for example, to accelerating digital transformation, incentivizing formalization, and significantly reducing the cost of credit. While we can make a case for subsidizing credit, what will be truly transformational will be to significantly reduce the cost of credit. In the end, we want businesses to build back better, and it is our core to ensure this happens. I want to conclude by reflecting on the next steps. We want to continue to nurture this partnership to ensure that we continue to track the impact of COVID-19 on businesses. That is very important because it will continue to inform us of options for action in this evolving pandemic situation. We also want to work with business leaders, as some have said, to identify and test policy options for various businesses across the governance spectrum, whether from the local level to the national level, and frankly speaking, at the continental level. Finally, we want to leverage the fact that Ghana is hosting the Secretariat of the Continental Free Trade Area to explore how best to protect businesses and help them transform, both in Ghana and across the continent. With this, I thank you very much, and I look forward to a fruitful conversation. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Frederick, for the wonderful presentation on behalf of the UNDP. We want to find out if Ayago is with us. If she raises his hand.
Anybody from the World Bank can do it.
Okay, all right. So if Ayago is not there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Ayago Wambile, Senior Economist at the World Bank. Thank you very much for the invitation and also for this chance to give these introductory remarks. I would like to start by thanking the GSS, particularly GSS leadership, who have been really working hard on the series of work, including the household surveys, community surveys, and now this business tracker. I would like also to thank the technical team at GSS who have been really working on this work, and the enumerators who have been providing support, as well as the UNDP team who have been we have been collaborating for some time, and we have continued the collaboration, which is really key, a new way of working together to ensure to provide a response to this pandemic. I would further thank the businesses who particularly took time to provide this information, which is really valuable, given that we would like to provide feedback on the effect of this pandemic. The World Bank has been working, as you all know, the World Bank has been working closely with on this survey, on these types of survey, the Business Pulse survey in over 40 countries around the world. And Ghana is one of the first countries where the results, this kind of result is available. Few countries have provided the first round of the data collection, and now in Ghana we have this first snippet of the impact of the COVID-19. So this is really good to have this kind of result and feedback to the government and development partners. As you know, looking at the work that has result that has been produced, we see that the survey shows that COVID-19 has been had a deep impact on Ghana's private sector through several channels. Firms are experiencing lower demand for their products, difficulty in accessing finance, and sourcing inputs, and face extended period of uncertainty. The World Bank is working closely with the government of Ghana to mitigate these negative impacts and assist businesses to survive pandemic and build resilience in the face of changed economic conditions. The results from the survey will play an important role in the bank's policy dialogue and strategy. And I would say that, you know, in the next steps, the bank will continue to provide support to government of Ghana, and also to provide support in terms of evidence, evidence data collection, to provide evidence in this area. And we see that digital solutions, focusing on digital aspects and providing support to the firms will really play key role. The bank will also continue to provide technical support in this area in terms of data collection and data analysis, and also continue work on cross-country analysis, given that we already have, you know, we are working with over 40 countries around the world. So probably doing cross-country data analysis based on these surveys, which are comparable, will really be good. And we will provide this kind of feedback to Ghana Statistical Service and the government, if this will show, you know, different aspects of what we can learn from other countries and the kind of approach. And I think this is really good collaboration between UNDP and Ghana GSS. So we look forward with this collaboration, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayago, for the wonderful presentation on behalf of the World Bank. We now will go on to our next on agenda, which is a presentation of key findings. And this will be done by our Professor Samuel K. Nim, the government statistician. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. So my presentation would cover 4 areas. I would want to start with the motivation, which has been partly addressed from all 3 presentations from GSS, UNDP, and the World Bank. But I'm going to emphasize on some key issues that we have not paid attention to based on our social discussions, but are really issues that are affecting businesses, for which reason we decided to do this survey, not just once, but follow the businesses over time. So I'll share with you some 5 issues for our consideration. Then to put the discussion in a context, I have 12 issues on notes on methods so that we would interpret these numbers that we're going to share with you in a particular context so that each use would achieve the highest benefits that is expected. Then we'll go on to the highlights of the findings and we'll conclude with some upcoming activities. So clearly, we can never deny the fact that both from a health and a non-health perspective, business operations and performance are being affected. But as I indicated, what we are not too sure about is whether we've exhausted the dimensions in which businesses have been affected, of which we share with you from our point of view some of the dimensions. So I've highlighted the last 4 issues as issues that moving forward GSS would want to engage with, and some of them that beyond GSS will need other organizations to help us with data to work on it. So one of the dimensions that we would want to mention are the disruptions in labor supply as a result of COVID-19 related morbidity. We've had a lot of discussions, data on mortality, but little has been talked about from the perspective of morbidity. But we all would appreciate the fact that morbidity would lead to disruptions in labor supply. There's this other argument that we've not had so much discussion on, which focuses on self-exclusion from work and the disarranged telework engagement. And for a number of businesses, firms in Ghana, both private and public sector, this was the first time we had to develop a telework policy, and how we're going to work with it posed various challenges to different organizations. So moving forward, as I indicated, we would want to have organizations coming on board, helping us with data from these 3 perspectives, that is morbidity, mortality, self-exclusion from work as a result of the disarranged telework engagement, and see how that would give us the true reflection on how businesses are being affected by COVID-19 and the related responses. The second dimension that we would want to think through is the business closures. Clearly, one of the major issues that led to closures of businesses was the partial lockdown in Greater Accra and Greater Kumasi, and indeed some pockets of the central region. Once we had partial lockdown, what that meant was that businesses naturally in these areas had to close down. Indeed, they had to close down involuntarily. For some other regions, we should also have in mind that because both their inputs and their outputs is from these regions, that is Greater Accra and Greater Kumasi, if they rely solely on inputs from these regions that were partially locked down, it means they would also have to close down as a result of the partial lockdown that occurred in Greater Accra and Greater Kumasi. We also look at slowdown and disturbances in demand for goods and services. And there was a slowdown, there were disturbances in demand for goods and services for diverse reasons. I mentioned 3 of them. One had to do with the wider effect of the partial lockdown, anxiety among consumers, and this anxiety among consumers led to sort of a hastened spending, new prioritization of spending, scale of preference, and thirdly, the border closures also contributed to a slowdown and disturbances in demand of goods and services. Also, there were interruptions in supply of inputs and access to finance, which I've explained by other regions and even the regions that experienced the lockdown. And also the global disturbances as a result of COVID-19 also impacted on performance operations of businesses. Then finally, we talk about trough in sales and in sales, not profit, but moving into the next waves, we'll see the possibility of getting profits. The second area that we thought was the prompting reason for us to look at how COVID-19 and related responses have affected businesses was to get a sense of which type of businesses, and here we restrict business to the size that is micro, small, medium, and large sizes, depending on the number of employees and sector, that is the three main sectors, have been affected and in what dimensions have they been affected. Then the third area was to look at whether the effect varied given background characteristics such as ownership structure, and some of the characteristics from the perspective of ownership structure is whether it's wholly owned by Ghanaians, it's wholly owned by foreign nationals, or it's owned by both Ghanaians and foreign nationals. And also we wanted to look at whether if the ownership is male dominated, female dominated, whether that to an extent would influence the ingenuity that firm owners can bring on board to abate the effect of COVID-19. Other background characteristics had to do with location, age, legal status, and registration of these businesses. And here we're looking at registration to give us a sense of whether the business is in the formal sector or the informal sector. And also this would give us a sense of whether the informal sector was hit the hardest relative to the formal sector, or really there wasn't any variation in terms of the effect on formal and informal businesses. Then further to this, we'll look at in what ways did these background characteristics experience the effect. Then the fourth area will be to look at how businesses responded to the effect of COVID-19. So some of the things that we're interested in is whether they decided to go digital, whether they decided to use mobile as means of communication, so that as we adhere to the restrictions on physical distancing, it wouldn't impact because we live in a digital world now. Then the fifth area was from three perspectives in terms of what next. And as was mentioned in the opening remark, there is a stimulus of 600 million Ghana cedis, and the question is whether this stimulus is enough or is going to areas that would help businesses to recover. Then we looked at issues of benefits, issues of re-employment, expectations, and duration. Sorry, I've just been alerted that I'm not sharing my screen. So 1 second, let me do that. Frederick, I'm being told that the host has disabled the attendee screen sharing. So if it can be activated from your end.
Praise.
Yes,
praise,
we'll do
praise
that.
good.
Yeah, we are doing that.
Okay.
Okay, Prof, you should be able to share your screen now. Sorry about the inconvenience.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Praise. Can I kindly request that you mute yourself if you are not talking? We're getting feedback, please.
Oh, Massa,
Praise, can you mute all the others? We are getting feedback, please. So on the notes on methods, we reached out to both non-household and household businesses. And what this meant was that we used the Ghana Living Standard Survey to get businesses that were household-based, and used the Integrated Business Establishment Survey to get to both private and, for that matter, public firms that we sampled from for this exercise. Stratification was guided by three broad variables: regional characteristics, that is the 16 regions, so that we can get representation across all the regions. The businesses and sector of operations also informed the stratification that we did in terms of the size of the business and the sector in which the business operated, i.e. agric, industry, or services sector. Our target sample was 5,675 businesses. And during the course of data collection, we need to revise our strategy in reaching out to businesses. This is simply because, as I said, the sampling frame was derived from the Integrated Business Establishment Survey, which was conducted in 2015. So 5 years down the line, we had quite a number of businesses that were non-operational, others that changed their telephone numbers, so it was difficult reaching out to them. So this occasioned the replacement sample of 4,248. So conditioning on our initial target of 5,675, our response rate was 76%, which meant that we successfully interviewed 4,311 businesses across the 16 regions of the country. The sample was drawn from the Ghana Business Register, the non-farm establishment from the Ghana Living Standard Survey in 2017, and also to make up for the dominance of the micro and small enterprises, we got a list from the National Board for Small Scale Industries to augment our sampling as a result of, as was indicated earlier, the non-response that we got from the Integrated Business Establishment Survey. In view of COVID-19 responses, we didn't have the opportunity to do face-to-face mode of data collection, which has been the main mode of data collection in GSS. But as was indicated last Thursday, we had the opportunity to get expertise from the Innovations for Poverty Action, who walked us through how to use computer-assisted telephone interviews for data collection. Data collection spanned 26 May to June 17th, and we would have to put this data collection in its right context. So I remind all of us of the dates in which key things happened as far as response to COVID-19 is concerned. It was the partial lockdown in Greater Accra and Greater Kumasi, which occurred between March 31st and April 19. I must indicate that for some of the questions, we had a reference period of 7 days, and for some of the questions, we had a reference period of 30 days, depending on the import of the question. And also for some of the responses, we had a 12-month reference period to enable us do a year-on-year comparison. Also, the borders of Ghana were closed on March 22nd, 2020. And as was indicated, with businesses that relied on input or had to export their output would also be affected, although we are mindful of the fact that the border closure was mainly on human movement. It invariably, depending on the way we do businesses, it invariably affected the movement of goods for that matter. And also with the global restrictions on borders, it's invariably also affected global movement of goods and services. We've been able to collect data on 70 analyzable variables, and this is why moving forward, we're going to institutionalize these releases. Today is giving us just a sense of a univariate and bivariate analysis of just selected variables, less than 15 of the variables. So it means we have in excess of 55 variables that are still waiting for analysis to be conducted on them. We need to put the numbers that we're going to share with you in a context, and I kindly request that we pay particular attention to these numbers, especially our media colleagues as they report the use of these numbers. We're going to make references to the Integrated Business Establishment Survey, which gives us an opportunity to extrapolate from the sample to see what is happening at the national level. So this data is coming from the 2015 IBES, that is the Integrated Business Establishment Survey, which indicated that for both private and public establishments, we had in total 638,234. We are very conservative with the way we do extrapolation in this presentation by working with this number. Again, we know that because this is yet to be updated, there's the likelihood that natural growth would have led to an increase in this number by a certain proportion by now. Of this is 638,234, 80% of them, meaning 509,033, are in the micro sector. And by way of definition, the micro sector are establishments that employ 1 to 5 persons. Another 18% can be found in small, that engages with more than 5 and less than 20. So putting the two together, it tells us that 98% of establishments in Ghana are predominantly micro and small. And we have less than 0.5% of the establishments in Ghana being large. In terms of the number of persons that are engaged, of the 638,234, we have 3,102,917 persons that are being engaged. And out of this, we have close to 63% of them in micro and small enterprises. So although we have less than 0.5% as large establishments, it's able to take on 16.6% of the total number of persons that are engaged by these firms, which means that 515,152 persons are engaged in the 2,539 establishments that we have in Ghana. For purposes of the extrapolation that we have done in this presentation, we did that based on the number of private businesses, which out of the 638,234, we have 523,329 private businesses. The difference between that are those in the public sector. Colleagues, I'm happy to share with you some key findings, as I indicated earlier on, from a univariable perspective and some bivariable perspective. We started one of the key concerns that motivated us to go into this, and this has to do with closures of businesses. So the question that was posed to the businesses that we interviewed gave them 4 options to indicate whether they are currently open or during the partial lockdown period, they kept their firms open. Whether they are partially open with some activities closed whilst others are still on course. And the last 2 categories focus on closure. And we distinguish between temporary closure and permanent closure. Of this, we realized that 30,000 businesses have closed down. And this we are making reference to those that have been permanently closed down. 30,000 businesses have closed down or did close down, during the partial lockdown period. And also when we put together those that currently they are temporarily closed down and they are permanently closed down, we have about 85,000 of businesses that are still closed down strictly as a result of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the related responses. From our point of view, with all these interventions that are being rolled out by the government, these are the businesses that we need to focus on in terms of the 85,000 that are temporarily closed down or are permanently closed down. We move on to see how these closures vary across the different sizes of businesses. And more than 2/3 of businesses that were either permanently or temporarily closed down were micro-sized firms. Our concerns heighten when we move this as analysis from the perspective of during the partial lockdown period and post the partial lockdown period, where we see that a higher number of the micro-sized firms have closed down. And this is worrying because during the close down, we got 70% of these micro-sized firms closed down, and the period after the partial lockdown, strictly between the months of April and May, we see an additional 15% of micro-sized firms that have closed down. The key question is, how do we get these businesses to come back to their normal engagement, and whether the interventions that we are rolling out would adequately reach out to all these businesses. We further look at the closure from a sector perspective. It didn't come as a surprise to see that education sector dominated. This is partly because of the closures of our schools, but it came as a surprise to see some other subsectors, specifically sectors that had at least 1 out of every 10 of these businesses closing down. These businesses that came as a surprise to us included health-related businesses or firms, construction or utilities, and those in the primary sector. And here primary, we make reference to agriculture sector. Another sector that was hit the hardest was accommodation and food subsector that we had close to 1/4 of them still closed down post the partial lockdown period. And exactly these are giving us guidance on the targeting that needs to be done if we want the impact or the recovery plans to achieve its optimal return. We further look at the slowdown of demand of goods and services, and the question that we posed to these businesses was just for them to tell us whether the demand for their goods and services had remained the same, had increased, or had decreased as a result of COVID-19 pandemic and the related responses. And we saw more than 476,000 businesses that experienced a decline in their demand for goods and services. And in my introduction, I indicated that this reduction in demand could have arisen for diverse reasons. One had to do with the wider effect of the lockdown. And the aspect that we may want to pay attention to is the new spending priorities that consumers will now focus on as a result of the anxiety that we continue to experience because of the uncertainty that surrounds COVID-19 as far as when it's going to abate and the extent to which it's going to go. We also realized that 26,000 of these businesses indicated an increase in the demand of their goods and services. And this was really driven by what is happening in agric and other industries. Here we talk about other industries because we isolated the manufacturing subsector. So putting agric and other industries together, we saw that 14% of them indicated an increase, which is counter to a majority that is about 9 out of 10 indicating a slowdown in the demand of their goods and services. We further look at interruptions from a supply perspective, and here we talk about supply of inputs and access to finance. And about 51% of all firms, that is 252,000 of firms, face difficulties in finding inputs. And also this can be related to the fact that we had restrictions on our mobilities. So once you are getting your input from other geographical areas, and once we had restrictions, you'll be constrained in getting these inputs. And also we talked about the border closures, and once you rely on imports for your input or for your input for that matter, with the closures of borders is going to affect, or you're going to have difficulties getting your input. So we had 51% of all businesses indicating that they face difficulties. Also, we realized that 131 businesses indicated having challenges with accessing finance. And most of them were in other services. Again, we say other services because we isolate some of the key services in this context, accommodation and food, which hypothetically we knew that was going to be hit hardest with the pandemic. So beyond accommodation and food services, all the other services had the highest impact of difficulties in accessing finance, as more than 57,000 of them indicated so. The lead subsector that had challenges with access to finance is agric and other industries. And again, for emphasis, other industries is all industries with the exception of the manufacturing subsector. And we had 11,000 of businesses indicating that there are challenges in accessing finance. We do a further analysis from the perspective of whether there's been a trough in the sales of the businesses that we spoke to. And indeed, we realized that between March 2019 and March 2020, there had been a dip of about 26% in the sales of businesses. This further heightened when we moved the data period from March to April. And this is a bit more worrying in the sense that March, we would all appreciate the fact that it was under the period of the partial lockdown. But once it was lifted somewhere 17th of April, we're expecting that we'll see some gains in terms of sales of businesses. But to the contrary, we saw a 10 percentage point higher in terms of the difference on a year-on-year change in sales of businesses. We look at how this disaggregates at the sector level, and we compare March 2019 with March 2020, April 2019 with April 2020. And we realize that for the manufacturing subsector, between the periods March 2019 and April 2019, we had an increase from 32.4 million Ghana cedis to 44.9 million Ghana cedis. This was a gain that one was expecting to have seen in 2020, but for COVID-19, we didn't see this change. And we realized that the gains recorded in the manufacturing subsector for March and April 2019 was not realized for the same period. The accommodation and food subsector recorded the highest trough in sales. So although our bars mask the effect of the accommodation and food subsector, indeed the accommodation and food subsector recorded the highest decline in sales to the tune of 57%. This was followed by trade, which recorded a dip in sales by 35%, and the sector that recorded the least change or dip in sales was other services sector. And again, for emphasis, other services is all the services sector minus accommodation and food subsector. And they realized, or businesses in the other services subsector indicated a dip of 5%. We now turn on to how businesses responded to COVID-19, the pandemic itself, and the related responses. And from the survey, we came to the realization that more than 41,000, indeed close to 42,000 of workers, corresponding to 1.4% of them, indicated that they had lost their jobs during the partial lockdown period. And the sector that saw a lot more workers losing their jobs was the accommodation and food subsector. Again, we had in excess 770,000 persons that experienced a reduction in their wages, and this corresponds to 25.7% of workers. And the other services subsector were mostly affected. We look at how businesses responded from the perspective of digitization, and we saw that only less than 10% of businesses adopted or intensified the use of internet for their operations. It means 90% of businesses did not consider the use of digitization, the use of technology as a way of averting the challenges associated with COVID-19. Also, we saw close to 2/5 of businesses adopting the use of mobile phones or mobile money, for their business transactions. The other area that we wanted to get a sense of how businesses are going to recover is their own expectations about COVID-19 moving forward. So we set up 3 scenarios for businesses. One scenario where we don't assume whether the future is going to be gloomy or otherwise. So we start by saying that don't think about any underlying assumptions and tell us what is going to happen to sales and employment. So without any underlying assumptions, we have businesses saying that we're going to see a 1% and a 5% respective reductions in sales and employment. Then the second scenario was to assume a very pessimistic argument or perspective for that matter in terms of what is going to happen in the next 3 months. And from that pessimistic point of view, we had businesses saying that sales were going to drop by 24% and employment by 15%. And from a very optimistic perspective, in the event where COVID-19 subsides in the next 3 months and we're returning to normalcy, what do we expect to happen to sales and employment? And businesses indicated that 25% of our sales would go up and employment would also go up. In terms of desired policies from these businesses that we interviewed, 3 key issues came up as priority interventions that they expect from the government. And it's refreshing to learn that as part of the 600 million stimulus, the conditions surrounding it responds to some of these concerns. Specifically, the topmost priority desired policy of businesses, which talks about subsidized interest rate. And we had in excess of 60% of the businesses that we interviewed indicating so. So with all the moratorium and the soft conditions associated with the stimulus that the government has rolled out, it is expected that it will go to the right businesses and it will respond as part of their recovery strategy. We had about 32% of businesses indicating that there should be some form of cash transfer, not from a loan perspective. Again, from our point of view, this is something that could be challenging given the broader effect of COVID-19 on the economy as a whole. But definitely this is something that through engagement, we'll see how it's feasible, that is between the policymakers and the businesses. The third component that had 21% of businesses indicating as a desired policy, which we least play priority on, is the issue of deferred rental payment. And again, this is something that could be looked into in terms of some arrangement between the key stakeholders, that is owners of properties, the government, and businesses, to see how we can soften the effect of COVID-19 on businesses with a proposal of a deferred rental payment. Based on these, we share with you the highlights of the business tracker based on the COVID-19 rapid survey. So the first of the 8 highlights is that COVID-19 pandemic and the related responses compelled about 115,000 businesses to either permanently or temporarily close down. Sales of businesses reduced by 26% between March 2019 and March 2020, and further 36% when we moved from the lockdown period and compared April 2019 end April 2020. The accommodation and food subsector recorded the highest dip of 57%. More than 45,000 workers lost their jobs during the partial lockdown. And again, from the perspective of loss of jobs, we had the accommodation and food subsector being the most hit by the pandemic. And also, more than 770,000 workers of businesses had their wages reduced. Less than 10% of businesses adopted or intensified the use of internet for their operations, leaving 90% of businesses still working in their traditional mode of engagement without using or harnessing the returns of technology. On the average, close to 131,000 businesses indicated that they had challenges accessing finance. And from a government response point of view, businesses, close to 60% of them are requesting government to put out subsidized interest rate to cushion the effect of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for the wonderful presentation on the findings, on the key findings of the impact on business. We now would go to our next on agenda, which is discussions. And we would want to, it's basically a question and answer session where we would want to find out if participants have questions. You raise your hand, we see you, and then we allow you to ask a question, and our honorable professor will address those questions. Thank you very much. So let's see by hand those who have questions so that Prof can address them. All right, so whilst we wait for the virtual participants to ask their questions, journalists around, if you have questions, please raise your hand so that Prof can answer questions.
Please, Mr. Akomanyi, you can go ahead. You have the floor.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation, and congratulations to all the partners that worked on this tracker. My very quick question, before that, my name is Eric Akomanyi. I work with the IOM, International Organization for Migration. I would want to ask if there was a gender dimension to this study to see possibly the impacts in terms of gender, because from our observation, gender responds differently to the issue of the pandemic. And so we'll be happy to know if there were some gender dimensions to the analysis. Thank you very much. Over.
Patience, let's hear you. Patience Foley. Right, so okay, Patience says, I would like to know if the religious sector was factored in this research. What was the impact of them? And so Prof, if you could address. That's all for now from the. Well, that's all for now.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, we did take into consideration in gender dimension, and I mentioned that in my introductory remark. Specifically, we looked at the gender dimension from the perspective of ownership. In this first edition, we are not presenting the results on gender, but certainly it's going to be a highlight story in the subsequent presentations. So we asked firms in terms of ownership, whether it was male-dominated, female-dominated, or it was an equal proportion between males and females. And you are right to say that we expect that this would impact how businesses would be affected and also how they're going to respond to COVID-19. So in our next release, we're going to have a presentation on that. We did not look at the effect of this survey on religious organizations.
The next question, Prof, is from Christian Boji. Yes, thanks for the excellent presentation. Any findings on effect on import commodities since borders were closed and we see shortage in some pharmaceutical supplies, regular spare parts, etc. Right. Let's have Kamara Bumi. Your hand is up. Please, let's hear your question.
Okay, good morning. Let me also congratulate Prof and his team for a very wonderful job. I mean, this is very rich. You know, even though we are seeing all a few of the variables that they have already covered. So my question is just from the slides. I see that most of the comparison is between what has happened, you know, pretty much what I call the COVID period, within the COVID period, like the situation in March. I was wondering whether, you know, we have pushed a little bit to ask these firms to recall, you know,
Camera, we cannot hear you. I think
before the COVID, you know.
Camera, can you repeat your question?
Can you hear me?
Please start all over. Your question, your line was truncated around the line.
Hello?
Yeah, Camera, your line was truncated. Can you repeat your question?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, it's better.
Okay, so what I was saying is that we see a lot of comparison between what the situation was in March, you know, and what the situation was in April. So I wanted to know whether the survey did ask these firms to recall, you know, basically what the situation was before the COVID itself. You know, we know pretty much even by end of February to early March, you know, firms have started adjusting because they knew, you know, something was happening all around the world. So if we can know what the situation was in early January for most of these firms, or even what the situation was in the comparative period of, let's say, March last year, you know, that will enrich our analysis. To know, you know, what some of the seasonalities. Thank you very much.
I think, Prof, I think we can take these two ones.
Sorry about that, I muted myself. Moving forward, both issues that have come up are definitely issues that we can explore. What we are going to do is to put on our website the questionnaire that we use for the data collection, or share it, for that matter, share it with all persons who are present on this meeting, so that any detailed analysis or specific analysis that you want done, you can let us know, and we're going to do that. So indeed, we had questions that would give us a sense of how the closures of our borders impacted on businesses. So we asked firms whether it's the kind of business or operations that rely strictly on imported items, for which reason the closure of our borders or the closure of borders of other countries would impact on their activities. So certainly we can provide descriptive discussions on that in our subsequent releases. Also, the question on whether we had questions to get these businesses to give us a recall. Yes, we have questions related to that. And in a couple of my slides, I made reference to what happened in March 2019 and April 2019. Indeed, there are some questions that we did recall, especially from the sale perspective for the past 3 months. And for some others, we looked at it for another different duration, depending on the ability of businesses to recall or otherwise. Given these questions that have come up, I would want to make categorical that in our subsequent releases, we're going to focus on 5 key areas or 5 key issues. And as was indicated, if a particular organization is interested in any specific issue that we captured in our instrument, please don't hesitate to let us know, and we'll give you that, that analysis. So the first area that we're going to pay particular attention to in our next release is to examine the factors that either lessen or heighten the effect of COVID-19, the pandemic, and the related responses, using 2 variables as outcome variables, that is sales and employment. So here we're going to do more than a bivariate analysis, taking sales and employment as our output variable. We're going to look at factors that have come up, such as gender, such as import, such as where they get their inputs from, and the size of the firm, the sector in which the firm operates. So we're going to get a sense of how sales and employment have been influenced, in the sense that these factors, some of them would give some businesses resilience, and other factors will sort of make the businesses fragile, depending on the characteristics of the firm. Then we're going to see whether the variations in sales and employment, which will be our 2 key performance variables, have varied based on geographical location. In this presentation, we did talk less on the geographical effects of COVID-19 on sales and employment. Moving forward, we're going to interrogate how geographical locations and other background characteristics, including gender, have impacted on sales and employment. The next thing that we're going to do is to look at the net impact of COVID-19 on performance of businesses. You recall that in my presentation, I indicated that although we saw substantial number of firms indicating a decrease in their sales, we saw some of them, up 5% of them, saying that they had their sales going up. So we would have to look at the net impact of COVID-19 on the performance of businesses. Then the 4th area that we're going to look into moving forward is to examine the effectiveness of innovative coping strategies of businesses. As was mentioned, less than 10% of businesses adopted digital modes of engagement. So we're going to see whether whatever type of digital intervention that they dispense is really sustainable or otherwise. And finally, once we're going to do a panel data, as was mentioned, at least we're going to approach these businesses for the next 3 times, additional 2 times up to the end of the year. So it'll give us an opportunity to assess the responsiveness of government interventions based on the cohort of firms that we're going to follow over time. So in August, that is this particular month, we're going to start with the wave 2, and hopefully by September, we're going to give you the results of both wave 1 and wave 2. And in October, we'll do the 3rd wave of the data collection exercise.
Yeah, Prof, thank you. So let's take a question from the journalists here, then we can go on to the virtual questions.
All right. Your findings indicate that less than 10% of businesses adopted or intensified the use of internet for their operation. And this is one would have expected that the number would have been higher than the less than 10%. If the businesses attribute anything to why just you have less than 10%.
Yeah.
We've been talking to the regional breakdown of the businesses that manage across the private sector. So, do you know whether we started with at the time these businesses were having a dip, we saw an upside in the production of goods. Want to find out whether this research something this upside in the production of goods. And the other question is, so we are used to conducting research and getting findings.
sad aspect of this is to leave the findings together. That's the question. Can you comment on that? Whether this would not be the same as other research?
All right, so Prof, should I read the other two? Okay, so there is a question by Edward Jombla. He says, what were the key coping mechanisms employed by businesses to cushion the effects of the pandemic on their expenditure and income? And then there is Kennedy Dumetu. Your hand is up if you can ask your question.
Thank you very much, and Prof, congratulations for the good work done. My name is Kennedy from Ministry of Employment. My network was quite disturbing, so I don't know whether this has been covered. I want to find out whether the survey factored in job losses as a result of the closure of the businesses, and also whether those who lost their jobs were given some packages as a take-home. Thank you.
Thank you. The first question is related to the 10% of businesses that adopted internet or other digital modes of engagement to avert the challenges associated with COVID-19, and whether we had questions that elicited reasons why we had such a small number or otherwise. We didn't do a follow-up on questions related to why we had a small percentage for that. But we can make inference from what we got from the household job tracker in terms of why we had about 35% of children not engaged in any form of learning, and they attributed that to the lack of access to internet services and also lack of computer to enable them do that. It would come to me as a surprise if there is some other reason other than what we got from the household survey. The second question is related to the regional breakdown of how COVID-19 impacted on businesses. Let's keep our appetite up for that. As I indicated, we've institutionalized these releases, and in our next release, as was mentioned, we'll present the regional breakdown and do some other background characteristics from the perspective of ownership, age, and so on. Then the other issue that came up, which had two perspectives to it, and I'm very happy that question came up because in my articulation of our next steps, I did indicate that we're going to look at the net impact. This is important for us because certainly some economic activities have seen a surge, specifically things that we didn't used to work with, the nose masks, the sanitizers, and all the protocols that have come up as a result of COVID-19 are establishments that will see a surge in their production. So definitely they're going to see a balance of some firms seeing a positive impact and others seeing a decline. But majority of them, as we've seen from this presentation, that is about 90% of them have seen a decline in their sales or the demand for their goods and services. But moving forward, we're going to do sector by sector analysis to get a sense of how this has changed across different subsectors. The question on research and how we're going to get these findings fully utilized is we counting on our media, and I'm happy we have somebody from the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relations joining us, and I'm hoping that these policymakers who are on this platform will carry the research findings forward. Certainly one of the things that COVID-19 has brought to the fore is a stronger engagement with research. COVID-19 has exposed us to our inadequacies in terms of knowledge of the pandemic itself, and secondly, how the pandemic is impacting on other activities. So we are hopeful that once we have taken the lead to provide this data, and as I said, we have 70 or over 70 analyzable variables in this data set, we are hoping that researchers, academia, policymakers will look at the instrument and we can give them further descriptive analysis, and they can do a more thorough multivariate analysis with the data that we are putting out there. So hopefully we're going to move away from it gathering dust on our shelves. In terms of the job losses, we were able to do further disaggregation in terms of the underlying issues, such as whether when they were laid off, it was strictly because of the closure, or when they were laid off, they were given some sort of benefit to compensate for the challenges associated with a worker being laid off. But certainly in the next wave, as I indicated, once it's a cohort of firms that we are following over time, these are additional questions that we can follow up on these workers. Indeed, I must indicate that GSS, our interest now is for us to work strongly with a business register that integrates households and business surveys. And moving into the next 5 years is one of the key activities that we're going to undertake. We do our integrated business establishment surveys every 10 years after, that is 2 years after the population and housing census. But definitely within the 10-year period, we need to continue to update the business register, and more importantly, link the business register to our household surveys, which would help us get a deeper understanding of how something that affects the household would affect the business sector and vice versa. So certainly moving forward, we're going to do that.
Thank you, Prof. Let's take the last question. Says that, did the survey examine the effect of COVID-19 on startups, innovation hubs, and incubators? If not, could you include this in the follow-up study, the net impact on sales and business performance? That's the last question.
Okay, thank you very much, Seth. Moving forward is certainly something that we have to bring on board. I do appreciate the fact that we could tease out something from the current instrument to indicate whether the firm is a startup or not, using the age of the firm, but it's not a good proxy to do that. We need to have other variables to inform whether it's a startup or otherwise. Indeed, we didn't look into whether innovation hubs and incubators would have a different line of effect as far as COVID-19 pandemic and the related responses are concerned. But certainly this comes across as something that is interesting, and we'll look into it in our subsequent surveys.
So thank you very much, Prof. Well, before Prof gives his closing remark, we want to thank the 146, now 148 participants virtually, and then the media persons here. Prof is going to give his closing remark, and I'm sure he's going to add his appreciation. Thank you, Prof. So, closing remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And indeed, the number that we have on this release is higher than the number that we got during the household jobs tracker, which gives us a lot of fulfillment at Ghana Statistical Service, and we really appreciate that. Moving forward, we are hoping to see a much higher number with the release of the local economy tracker, which, as indicated, would be shared with you in terms of the date and time somewhere later in the week. We are hoping that this engagement would be sustained at different levels, but its sustenance should be done with a lot of circumspect. Permit me to clarify something from last week's presentation in terms of the reportage on the effect of COVID-19 on households and jobs. In that release, we did indicate that 22 million persons have been affected by reduced income. That variable for computing the 22 million was a household level variable. In Ghana, we don't have households to the tune of 22 million. With our 31 million population and an average household size of 4 persons in a household, our household population ranges between 7.5 million and 8.5 million. So what we did from that survey was, based on the number of households that reported an experience with a reduction in income levels, we extrapolated for the number of persons that will be affected. So for clarity, the 22 million are not people who experience a reduction in income. The 22 million are persons that lived in households that had at least one person experiencing a reduction in income levels. So if you even think about our adult population, we don't have up to that population, let alone the working population. So going forward, I'm just requesting media people present on this platform to carry the message with exactly the context in which we've provided the numbers. As I indicated from this presentation, we have been very conservative with how we've done the extrapolation by paying emphasis on only the sample from the the census from the Integrated Business Establishment Survey. Ideally, we should have included the sample from the Ghana Living Standard Survey and also add on what we got from the National Board for Small Scale Industries. So once we get these numbers in the right context, we expect that policymakers, they are working with it, will yield the maximum returns. Thank you very much. And before I conclude, although Ayago mentioned it, we are very grateful to the firms that offered information as we went round. We kindly requesting them that we're going to come back to them, as I indicated, this month, August, and sometime in October. We want to see a much more higher response rate from 75% to somewhere in the region of 90%. We are urging them to cooperate with us because this is our mandate, and we are hoping that with the rich information that they give to us, it will help streamline the interventions that are being rolled out by the government. So on behalf of board, management, and entire staff of GSS, please accept our appreciation, and we look forward to a much closer engagement to the end of the year. Thank you.